Welcome to this lecture on the iFrame tag. As its name implies, this tag is used to create a frame within a web page which can display external content. This works much like a window or portal where the content being viewed actually resides in a different location, but it appears alongside your own content within your web page. We touched on the iFrame tag in an earlier lecture where I looked at how we can embed a YouTube video into a web page. That's a very common use for it, but in this lecture we'll look at some other reasons why you may use an iFrame. We'll also look at the HTML tag itself and explore the different attributes that it supports. By the end of this lecture you'll know what iFrames can do and you'll know how to use them in a website of your own. Let's start by looking at how iFrames actually work. Here on the left we have a pretty standard website template with placeholders to represent various blocks of content. In this template we have a header with a logo, we have a banner image, some feature icons and 3 information panels. On the right we have various web pages which represent another website. For now it doesn't really matter which site this is, just think of it as someone else's website. But what if we wanted to embed the purple page from that website within my own site? Here for example. Well, I could do this using an iFrame. All I'd need to do is add an iFrame tag to my web page and then point it at the location of the purple page on the other site. That would create a frame in my page which displays the content from the other site. The purple web page would still live on the other site, we'd just be looking at it through our iFrame. So why would you want to embed a web page from another website within your own? Well, there are many reasons why you may want to do this, but let's focus on some of the more common ones for now. First off, you may want to display your Facebook timeline directly on your website. It's okay having a link to your Facebook page, but why not embed your feed directly within your site? For example, if you wanted to display this Facebook page on your web page, maybe here, then an iFrame would allow you to do this. In this scenario, a cut down version of your Facebook page would be displayed, and best of all, it would update in real time as new posts were made. This immediately turns a static website into a dynamic one, with the latest information being displayed without needing any updates from you. Another common use for an iFrame is to embed some kind of widget within your site, something like the weather feed for example. If your website or business is associated with physical location, then showing your website visitors the local weather forecast in your area may be extremely useful. Maybe something that looks like this. This is an iFrame widget from the Meteo Blue website which shows the weather forecast for the next few days. You tell them what you wish to include in the widget, such as the location and information, and they provide the HTML iFrame code for you which would allow you to embed it somewhere on your site like this. Once embedded, this feed would update itself so that it always shows the current weather forecast. Again, this immediately turns a static website into a dynamic one. There are widgets like this available for many popular websites including Facebook, Instagram, Spotify and many more. We'll look at these examples in more depth in just a moment when we delve into some of the code. But first, let's look at the iFrame tag so that you know what we're working with. Here we have an example iFrame tag showing the most commonly used attributes. There are a few others such as refer policy and fetch priority, but these are less common so I won't go into these now. However, after this lecture, once you have a handle on the iFrame tag, I do recommend checking out the full list of attributes on W3 Schools or MDN. You may need them in the future if you embed more complex content into your site, or if you end up looking after other people's websites. For now though, let's start with the most common attributes so that you can get to grips with the iFrame tag. Firstly, please note that not all of these are required. If you want an iFrame to display content, then the only mandatory attribute is SRC, which stands for source. So let's start there. This attribute expects a URL, which tells the browser where to load the iFrame's content from. This can be a local URL which is relative to the page containing the iFrame, or it can be an absolute URL which points to another website entirely. Either way, this URL needs to tell the browser where to load the content from. We'll look at a few examples of this when we write some HTML code in a bit, but for now, know that this is where you specify the content's address. The next attributes are height and width. These expect numerical values in pixels, with the defaults being 150 pixels high by 300 pixels wide. Note that we don't need to specify the measurement units here, such as px. just basic numerical values which represent the amount of space that the iframe will take up on our web page. This brings me on to the next attribute, which is scrolling. Remember that an iframe is a window, and windows can scroll. We can then therefore use this attribute to tell the browser whether it should support scroll bars or not. The available values for this attribute are auto, yes, and no. Auto tells the browser to display scroll bars, but only when they're needed. That is, when the contents of the iframe is larger than the frame itself. Yes will always display scroll bars even if they're not needed, and no will never display them even if the content is larger than the iframe. In this last scenario, any content that falls outside the visible iframe area will be hidden from view and will be inaccessible. When requested, vertical or horizontal scroll bars will appear within the iframe like this. Their appearance may differ by browser, but when they're displayed, they'll allow the user to scroll the content up, down, left, and right. If the auto value is used, the browser may show one or both of the scroll bars depending on the size of the content. One thing to note at this stage is that this attribute has been deprecated, or at least that's what the MDN docs report. As a replacement, they tell us to use the style attribute's overflow property to control scrolling. I will cover this method later in the CSS section, however, at the time of writing this course, various browsers don't support this method, so the scrolling attribute is still very much alive despite what the docs say. In any case, browsers still respond to this attribute, and older websites will certainly still use it, so it's important that you know how it works. We'll play with this attribute a bit more when we come to write some HTML code in a bit. Next on the list of attributes is loading. The values for this can be eager or lazy, and these tell the browser whether the iframe should load its content immediately or defer loading until it's absolutely necessary. When eager is used, it will load the iframe content immediately, even if it's outside of the visible viewport. This will ensure that the iframe content has been loaded by the time the user scrolls it into view. This can be handy if the content is slow to load and you don't want any visible delays. This is the default behaviour if the loading attribute is not specified. Lazy, on the other hand, is far more relaxed and will load the iframe content when it's about to scroll into view. There may be occasions where the iframe appears way down the page and it's not even viewed by most users. In this scenario, it would be wasteful to load the content immediately if most people never even scroll far enough down to see it. It would be far better to load it in a lazy manner so that it only loads as and when required. The trade-off here is that if it does load as it scrolls into view, the user may see a slight delay in the loading of the content. This comes down to the individual website, but control over this behaviour is available via this attribute should you need it. Next up is frame border. This is another deprecated attribute, but I'm going to cover it here because many websites still use it within their HTML, and modern browsers do still recognise it. If you ever end up maintaining one of those websites, then you'll definitely need to know about this attribute. It is a fairly simple one though, with valid values of 1 or 0. 1 is the default value and means the iframe will have a border around it. 0 means it won't. As I mentioned though, this attribute has been deprecated, which means there are newer and better ways to do it. The recommended alternative is to use the style attribute's border property instead. Setting that to none will have the same effect as setting the frame border to 0. Again, we'll cover the style attribute including the border property in much more depth later in the course. Next on the list is the allow attribute. This tells the browser what the web page within the iframe is and isn't allowed to access. Typically, these will be features offered by the browser or the device. Things like access to the camera or microphone, for example. To start with, here's a full list of values that can be specified inside the allow attribute. I'm not going to go through each one of these as there's way too many, but feel free to pause the video here and take a look at the list. The allow attribute is not mandatory, unless the contents of the iframe require certain privileges in order to run. However, when specified, it accepts a basic list of items separated by a semicolon like this. What you enter here will depend on what the content of the iframe needs access to. For example, in an earlier lecture we looked at embedding a YouTube video. I mentioned that we needed to allow access to the accelerometer, autoplay, clipboard write, gyroscope and picture-in-picture. These are required in order for YouTube to react to user interaction and provide a better user experience. However, in that particular case, YouTube created the code for us and told us what to include in this attribute. When we created some code in that lecture, it looked something like this. Note the allow attribute and its list of values displayed here in red. Next, we have the allow full screen attribute. And if you start to get a little confused here, don't worry. If you read the list of values for the allow attribute just now, you may have noticed that there was a full screen value in there too. That sounds very familiar to this attribute, and that's because it is. Providing the full screen value in the allow attribute, or using this allow full screen attribute should, in theory, do the same thing. However, based on MDN docs, this attribute is considered legacy. It goes on to suggest that using the full screen value in the last allow attribute is the recommended way forward. That said though, as we've just seen in our example code, YouTube still uses this attribute when it generates code for you. This is likely because some browsers will look for the newer allow attribute, while others may still require this allow full screen attribute. If you want whatever's in your iFrame to be able to launch in full screen mode, I recommend that you use both. This way, no matter what the browser is expecting, you'll have both angles covered. And finally, I've included the sandbox attribute in this list. It may not be one of the ones that you immediately use, especially if you're using widgets generated from other sites, as they tend to write the code for you. However, it offers some important security features should you start to add more complex content to your site, so I thought it would be prudent to cover it now. Here's a list of values that this attribute supports. Again, there are lots here, so I won't go through each one. At a first glance though, some of these may appear to be similar to the allow attribute that we've just looked at, but sandbox is different. The concept of sandboxing something means keeping it separate and isolating it, in this case from the parent web page. The moment you add a sandbox attribute to an iFrame tag, even without any values, pretty much all operational permissions will be restricted, rendering the content within the iFrame low risk. You may then add back any specific permissions that you wish to grant by adding in the items from this list. For example, if you don't fully trust the content in your iFrame, maybe because it comes from another site, you can choose which permissions are granted to it. You may want to allow it to run scripts because it may need that to operate, but nothing else. In that scenario, you'd specify the sandbox attribute and restrict all permissions, then you'd add back in the allow script value. Adding a Twitter tweet button to your web page, for example, can be done using an iFrame. While Twitter is a reasonably respectable and trustworthy company, you may want to lock things down a little given that you're embedding it within your website. Not doing so may inadvertently give them access to certain aspects of your website, which is hosting the iFrame. While it's unlikely that Twitter themselves will do anything nasty, the same thing may not be true if they were hacked. So, in this scenario, if you wanted total peace of mind, you could set the sandbox attribute to restrict all permissions, and then add back the ones that the Twitter tweet button requires. In this case, that would be allow forms, allow pop-ups, allow pointer lock, allow same origin, allow scripts, and allow top navigation. All of these are required in order for the Twitter tweet button to work. I don't expect you to remember all of these, but I just want to give you a real life scenario as an example. Normally, when you're adding widgets from other providers, they'll tell you what they need access to. And that's it for the attributes. As I said, there are a few others, but these are the most common attributes that you may need to use within an iFrame tag. Now that you're familiar with how this tag hangs together, let's jump into some code and see if we can embed the Facebook feed that I mentioned earlier. I've opened an HTML file from my course downloads. You can do the same from your course downloads by opening the file Facebook iframe example blank.html. The location of the file is shown here. This particular file contains a useful URL which will allow us to create a Facebook feed. Like most widget creators, it actually generates the iframe code for us, which is great. When you visit this link, you should see the page Meta for Developers. If not, just Google Facebook plugins and navigate to the page plugin which we see here. To start with, note that there are many options on the left-hand menu. These take you to various tools which create different types of widgets, anything from embedded Facebook posts to like buttons. The one we're interested in is the page plugin. This will allow us to embed the live timeline from a specific Facebook page directly in our website. We'll start with this configuration section. This is where we can tell the code creator which page to pull the timeline from and specify a few settings to control its appearance. The first thing that it asks for is the Facebook page. This field expects a URL, and if we load Facebook in a browser window and navigate to the Facebook page, this URL will be displayed in the address bar. Here I have the Google UK Facebook page loaded, and I've simply copied the URL and pasted it directly into this field. When you tab away from the field, it will show us a preview of the page as it will appear in your iFrame. There are a few other fields that you can use to change the appearance, but I'll let you play with these. I'll stick with the default values for now. When done, we can click on the Get Code button. This will display a pop-up window containing various bits of code. There are two types of code here, the JavaScript SDK or an iFrame. I'm going to concentrate on the iFrame method for now. Simply click on the iFrame tab to view this. Their code isn't neat, but it's all there, and they wrote it for us, which has saved us a lot of time. If you copy and paste this into your website, you'll now have a working iFrame which shows the Google UK Facebook timeline. Before we do that, however, let's format the code that they've given us so that we can see what it looks like. Here we have the full iFrame HTML code neatly formatted to make it easier to read. I have chopped off some of the src attribute because that was really long, but we can see all of the other attributes that we discussed earlier in this lecture. Feel free to pause this video to give yourself a little time to review this code. Okay, so now we have some iFrame code that Facebook kindly wrote for us. Let's copy it and go back to our HTML file and paste it in so that we can try it out for real. I'm going to paste that code underneath my comment which gave us the Facebook URL. I'll format the code nicely so that we can read it, save the file, and then run it to see what it looks like. Here we can see the Facebook timeline from the Google UK page. All buttons and components work exactly as they do on Facebook, and the content of this frame will update in real time as new posts are added. Okay, so that's it for the iFrame tag. In this lecture, we've learned about the tag and its most common attributes. Plus, we've seen it in action with a Facebook timeline feed. As a quick recap, here's the list of those attributes again, and some links to resources where you can learn about anything we haven't covered here. As mentioned earlier, there are many other ways in which you can use the iFrame tag. I have included some additional HTML files in your course downloads as examples. These can be found in the Lectures HTML Tags iFrame folder. They include an example of embedding an Instagram post, a Spotify playlist, and a weather forecast. Feel free to take a look at those files and practice more with the iFrame tag. Next up, we'll look at one of HTML's generic container tags, the span tag. So when you're ready, head on over and we'll check out what it can do.